Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're exploring recent moves in Congress and the White House to fund U.S. allies while setting up a potential showdown with China over TikTok. President Biden signed the much-awaited foreign aid bill on April 24th, paving the way for more U.S. arms and funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The House also passed a bill to force the sale of TikTok from China-based ByteDance to an American company, setting up a potential showdown with Beijing. For more on this topic, we speak with Chris Tuttle, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations who focuses on the domestic roots of U.S. foreign policy. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past couple weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Hey, Freddie, how's it going, man?
Good, Kelly. We've had a weekend of finally some good weather here in DC, so it's been a nice weekend.
Yeah, I've for some reason my brain doesn't want to think that it's already the end of April, beginning of May. It's not allowing me to sort of realize that it's already 85 degrees. So I don't know. I'm having some trouble comprehending that the last 2 days, but it is nice. The weather has been great. So Freddie, what's on the docket today?
So first we'll be talking about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to China. Then we'll get into the most recent developments in the geopolitical realignment happening in the Sahel as Niger requests the departure of US forces from the country. For our last item before our interview, we'll be discussing the victory of a pro-China party in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. And finally, we'll turn to our interview with Chris about the foreign aid and TikTok bills in Congress last week. So we'll start off with China, where Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently concluded a 3-day visit to the country to discuss urgent issues in the US-China relationship with high-level counterparts. It was reportedly a contentious trip that saw the two sides address numerous thorny issues in the relationship, such as China's support for Russia in its war against Ukraine, US support for Taiwan, and China's alleged role in the opioid epidemic. So, Kelly, what do you make of Secretary Blinken's visit amid the numerous developments in the relationship that have happened in the last few weeks and months, such as the passage of more military aid for Taiwan and a potential for sale of TikTok?
So on this one, I think I'm going to start off with one good thing and then talk a bit about the difficulty with these kind of visits as well, and then end on a high note. So the first good thing to think about when talking about this is the fact that Secretary Blinken did go to China. If our listeners recall, there was a period of time there after Nancy Pelosi's visit and the balloon episode that we just kind of stopped any kind of visits or meetings with high-level Americans and Chinese. And, we stopped the military to military phone connection and all that kind of stuff. So that stuff's back on now after the meeting last November with President Biden and President Xi. So the fact that Blinken went is just a positive thing, that we're having these high-level talks with Chinese counterparts. He also met with President Xi, which is a good thing. It's something you're kind of hoping for in these types of visits. But that being said, the issues that the US and China have aren't going to be solved in, a visit by Secretary of Blinken to China. These are deep-seated strategic issues over China giving support to Russia in the war against Ukraine, whether or not China is going to invade or try to take over Taiwan, and how the U.S. supports Taiwan. This came at the time when we passed the aid bill that had $8 billion in it in military aid to Taiwan. So the Chinese, wouldn't have been pleased about that. We're talking about China's role in the fentanyl crisis. So, really tough conversations. But the good thing is, each side pushed each side on those. But after the fact, you normally get these, statements put out by both sides. They were fairly mild, nothing, crazy in these statements, either by the US or by China afterwards. So that's a good thing. But overall, it's good that we're having these meetings. Need to continue them so that we can eventually start to have these deeper discussions, if possible, on the larger geopolitical issues that are at the heart or the core of this competition. And then a good note, they did announce that there's going to be an upcoming bilateral meeting on artificial intelligence between the US and China. So that is a very good thing as we start to have these conversations between the US and China on how we're going to regulate artificial intelligence. What kind of caps are we going to put on what we're doing, what sort of transparency we're going to have into the algorithms and how these systems work, and all of that kind of stuff. So very important that they're having this meeting.
So next, we're going to go over to the Sahel, where there's been stark geopolitical realignment happening in the last few years. Recent coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and most recently Niger, that we've covered on this show, have toppled governments that were previously open to working with Western partners like France and the US, particularly on issues like counterterrorism and economic development. Niger's military junta in March requested the withdrawal of over 1,000 military and civilian personnel in the country, and the Department of Defense confirmed last week that they have begun departure measures. Niger simultaneously inked new defense deals with Russia, and the first batch of 100 Russian troops arrived in Niger last week. Kelly, how much of a blow are these developments for America's strategy in Africa, and how well does it fit into the broader geopolitical battle for influence between the West and countries like Russia or China?
Yeah, that's a good question, Freddie. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There are serious issues for the US strategy in Africa with what's going on in places like Niger. And it also ties into not just the US strategy in Africa, but the geopolitical competition between, the US and China, the US and Russia, the US and authoritarian regimes. So, at a basic level, at a basic geopolitical politics level, this is not a good thing because it's more moves towards authoritarian military dictatorship style governments, that moves places like Niger further away from democracy. It's not necessarily that surprising that the new junta in Niger has pushed out the US. They've really been, justifying their overthrow of the former government and their rules up to this point as a way to push back against what they saw as Western stooges in the governments. And that kind of goes for, in some way, shape, or form, for a number of these new military governments in the region. But, this is something that China, but especially Russia, will just kind of jump on, is this pushing these conspiracy theories, this history of colonialism, and pushing misinformation, disinformation about this to publics in Africa to turn them away from the West and the US. And it also allows then an opening for the Russians to come in because they're not seen as Western in the same way that a France or a US would be. So it allows room for the Russians, and especially groups like what was formerly known as the Wagner Group, to come in and really play a role in the governments. And that's also another downside, because that helps them to solidify these authoritarian rulers and gives them sort of an extra line of defense to keep them in place. And then another part of this is the counterterrorism aspect. There has been a large ISIS related group in this region for years now, and the US and the French have been in this region fighting those terrorist groups. And the removal of these Western troops is going to be a blow to that fight. The Russians are not going to be as good at it, especially the Wagner Group, who are, like I said, they're almost as much for solidifying the government, trying to skim some money where they can, not really all that interested in, fighting terrorists. So that's going to be a big issue to watch in the coming months, to see how these terrorist groups are responding, what they're doing in these countries, and whether or not they're able to sort of grow their reach at all. But overall, this is not a good outcome for the US from an African strategy perspective, or from a geopolitical sort of anti-authoritarian side of things either.
So, for our last story, we're going to go over to the Indian Ocean, where voters in the Maldives handed the party of the country's new pro China president a landslide victory in last week's parliamentary elections. The shock result gives President Mohamed Moizu, who took office in November after campaigning on a platform of improving relations with China and removing Indian troops garrisoned in the country, a broad mandate to shift Maldivian foreign policy eastwards. So, Kelly, what effects could this have on the kind of India-Chinese competition, and what effects could this have in a nation that has traditionally stuck very closely to India as its main partner?
Yeah, this was an interesting story to kind of take a look at and follow over the last couple of weeks. And it really speaks to this larger competition, just not only globally, but in this region, between China and those that it sees as sort of the ones they're competing against. And in this case, it's India, but you can also kind of lump in the United States there because of our growing security partnership with India, and the fact that India is a major rival to China, and India has been siding more with and leaning more towards the United States in certain regards, obviously not in regard to the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and things like that. But in terms of the China competition, India has been siding more with the West and the US. So when you look at sort of the China gains here, India loses aspect sort of things, it's an interesting story and fits into the ways that the Chinese over the past decade or so now have been going in and trying to gain influence in a lot of countries in the region. I mean, I think we've mentioned on this program before in some way, shape, or form the Solomon Islands. And a couple years ago, the shift towards the Chinese and the strategic corruption that Beijing was pushing in the Solomon Islands to gain influence over those countries and sort of turn them away from the US to some respect. So you're starting to see the same thing here with countries that are leaning towards India and trying to get in, create the influence to sort of try to pull them out of the Indian orbit. And it looks like they've been successful in this case. And it remains to be seen just how far they can pull them out of the Indian orbit. The largest patron for the Maldives has been India for a long, long time. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to just shift and end overnight, but it's definitely something worth watching moving forward to see how this goes, and to see maybe what other places the Chinese try to create influence and pull away from countries like India or the US. And I think, coupled with what happened in the Solomon Islands, we've already seen a shift in US strategy towards Pacific Islands, some of these other places in the Pacific and East Asia that weren't getting the level of attention that the Chinese were able to give them, and that sort of has been to the detriment of U.S. diplomacy and policy in the area. So we'll see if this serves as a wake-up call in some aspects to the Indian government to sort of keep their house in order a little bit more as far as it goes on those countries that have been a long-standing partner of theirs. You can't take those folks for granted anymore.
Yep, no, we have a lot of investment in China recently. We have a $200 million Maldives-China friendship bridge that was recently constructed, and we have an increase in other forms of aid at the same time as India has been cutting assistance to the island nation. So it's been a very wide opening for China, and it looks like, electorally at least, their opening has sort of paid off for the moment.
So that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation on the recent action in Congress on foreign military aid and a potential TikTok ban with Chris Tuttle. Chris is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations who focuses on the politics and processes behind U.S. foreign policy. He previously directed CFR's Renewing America initiative and served from 2015 to 2019 as policy director of the majority staff of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations under Chairman Bob Corker. Let's listen into the conversation. We're pleased to be joined today by the Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Chris Tuttle. Chris, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kelly. Glad to be here.
So I'm just going to hop right into it. This issue has been in the news quite a bit as of late, but a lot has happened with Congress and foreign policy in the last week or so with the recent legislation that the Biden administration signed into law on April 24th. We're going to focus on the Ukraine aid part of that bill and the possible TikTok ban. We'll start with the Ukraine aid package. So this took forever to get passed. What was the holdup, basically?
Yeah, so I'll go back a little bit into some history. When Ukraine was invaded by the Russians in February of 2022, we quickly needed supplemental funding packages in order to continue our commitment to Ukraine. And you saw the beginnings of some static on the Republican side, particularly in the House, of folks voting against the Ukrainian assistance. So in May of 2022, there was a big multi-billion-dollar supplemental that passed. You saw about a quarter of House Republicans voting against that. And it wasn't so much that they were pro-Russian or opposed to Ukraine. They were just saying there are other priorities here at home, particularly the border, that are much more important that we should be funding. And this was sort of the beginning of a slow burn within sort of the Republican conference in the House and to some degree in the Senate. And you saw the numbers of Republicans voting against supplemental assistance to the Ukrainians ticking up. And so by December, we had passed another supplemental. I think by the end of 2022, we were at about the $50 billion mark. And that was expected to last about through September of 2023. In 2023, in August, Biden announced a $24 billion assistance package to Ukraine. And then we got mired in the September, October motion to vacate Kevin McCarthy's speakership, the whole shutdown battle. So there was a lot going on, and that was part of what took a long time. Then Mike Johnson of Louisiana assumed the speakership in October of 2023. And he had previously voted against Ukraine assistance. And you saw him almost immediately warming up to the idea that maybe it was the appropriate role of the United States to be helping the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians. Now, people have basically said that this was because he was getting classified intelligence briefings. I think it may be partly that, but I think he viewed himself as not just a representative of district, but a larger officer of the United States. And he had a lot of people within his conference that I think he liked and trusted. People like Mike McCall, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee. People like Mike Turner, who chairs the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. These folks were saying, you need to do this. This is the responsible thing to do. And Johnson pretty quickly, you could see, was sort of warming up to this idea, but he did have this threat of those sort of hardliners who did not want assistance to Ukraine. And so by February of 2024, the Senate took up a Ukraine, Israel, and Indo-Pacific security bill that included border funding and additional border controls. Trump came out and said this is not a good idea, and the Senate eventually rejected that in February, and then quickly turned around and approved a pretty substantial assistance package, including, again, Ukraine, Israel, Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, that kind of thing. And it sort of sat as Mike Johnson was trying to sort of corral his conference, check the political winds, see where they were going to blow, how much damage there might be. And I think what eventually happened is Donald Trump suggested this idea of a loan to Ukraine. And Johnson bought into that idea. It didn't really win a whole lot of purchase with the hardliners, but it did sort of diminish the Trump criticisms that might have otherwise come. So Trump largely sort of stayed out of the fray. And Mike Johnson went down to meet with him at Mar-a-Lago. Trump came out in a news conference and gave his support to Mike Johnson, saying he's doing a good job. And so that put him in a much better position to be able to finally pass this and pass it with not a majority of Republicans supporting it. So breaching what is called the Hastert rule, which was a rule by Speaker Dennis Hastert, saying that if we're going to pass something in the House, we have to pass it with a majority of the majority. Well, that didn't happen with Ukraine assistance.
Moving to the bill itself, though, what is in the Ukraine package, part of the bill?
So it's $61 billion for Ukraine. $23 billion of that is to replenish U.S. stockpiles. So we have been giving Ukrainians weapons that we already had in stock. So we need to replenish those systems, that ammunition, all of those things. An additional $11 billion to fund military operations in the theater. So getting all this materiel over there, doing security cooperation with our allies over there, it's $11 billion of that, and then $14 billion for Ukraine weapon systems. And we can go into sort of the laundry list of what those specific systems are. There's also some economic assistance in the bill. That is going to be done in the form of loans, or much of it is going to be done in the form of loans. So that's that Trump idea that we actually are loaning them money. And then there's also this provision that permits, it was called the Repo Act, which permits Russian sovereign assets that were seized after the invasion to be utilized to fund part of the additional assistance to Ukraine. Now, that's not a ton of money. It's, I think, anywhere from $6 to $8 billion. The majority of those assets are held in Europe. But those two items, I think, maybe kept Trump a little bit more under control because the loans were his idea. And also, they play into his broader argument that we in the United States seem to be on the hook for everything. and our European partners who have a lot more at stake, although they are funding Ukraine more than we are, it's not by a lot. That plays off of a long-standing issue that Trump had, but also previous presidents have had. Barack Obama called it sort of the free rider issue, where we keep spending over 3% of our gross domestic product on defense. The target for NATO countries is to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. And a lot of them are not meeting that commitment and haven't for a long, long time. This is part of a broader narrative, which is a pretty reasonable one, actually, that if we're going to all be a part of NATO, that we should be dedicating the resources, all of us, that are needed in order to protect Europe against this very thing. You know, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but if the Russians did decide to go into Poland, you could expect the Poles, who spend a good deal of money, and others who spend a good deal of money, to be able to, bring their A game, while the Belgians, who spend less than 1% on defense, probably are not going to be able to be that much help. So I hope that explains a little bit of what's in the bill.
Now, from a sort of just a credibility and sort of viewpoint of our allies and partners, what is the news coming out of this signing of this aid package finally? Is it, yes, relief that it finally got done? Or do you think it's more of a fear that, oh boy, this almost didn't get done because of domestic political issues in the US? Is there sort of a relief tied with a sense of trepidation on the part of the allies and partners when they see this and see what happened?
Yeah, I think they're looking at this as short-term gain, but ominous long-term pain ahead. I think that there are definitely signals being sent, not just by political leadership, but by the American people. The political leadership is reflective of the American people wanting to focus more at home. It doesn't necessarily mean that they want to step back from the world, but if they're given a choice, they see priorities at home as being more important. So I think that there is definitely concern that this might be not just the last tranche of money that's going to be going to the Ukrainians, but a broader sense that the United States might be stepping back from the world. When you look at the bigger picture, you've got obviously the hardliners on the right who are saying we should be focused more here at home. But you also are seeing increasing issues on the left. Take, for example, the assistance to Israel, and there are a lot of issues wrapped up in that. But there is a general sense, I think, on the right that America should be less involved in the world because the world is bad for America. There is a growing sense on the harder left edge that the United States should be less involved in the world because the United States is bad for the world. And you see that in things like trade, that we are exporting exploitation, environmental degradation, those kinds of things. So I think that's a strand that goes through. And in the initial days or the initial few months into the Ukraine war, you did see a number of folks from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, so this is about 60 members, signed a letter saying that we should be negotiating with the Russians. Now that quickly got tamped down and withdrawn. But I think there is a thread of stepping back from the world that goes obviously through the Republican Party. But I think that it is a nascent thing to keep an eye on within sort of the left edge of the Democratic Party as well.
So let's pivot now to the potential ban of TikTok. This was also included in the bill. And basically, the bill is forcing the sale of TikTok from the Chinese-owned ByteDance Corporation. And this was included as part of the final legislation. Why was that? And what does this sort of look like now moving forward? It's not like TikTok was, erased off of everyone's phones the next morning or anything like that. Like, what's the process look like here?
Sure. So the way it was included, there was debate on this. I mean, you take a look at Congress and, China's fresh out of friends, right? But there were concerns on sort of the civil liberties side, and there were concerns on sort of the overall cyber governance side, that if we start down this road, we open up a Pandora's box of China or other places going after Facebook, for example. And so the sort of idea of a free and open internet, a lot of the advocates of that viewed this as a potential problem, as well as sort of the civil liberties concerns, but essentially that information should sort of roam free, So there was debate over this, and I think it was eventually included in the House legislation to sort of force the Senate's hand to move on the TikTok ban. How this works is by January of next year, unless TikTok is sold from ByteDance, the app will disappear from app stores. You won't be able to download it anymore. And you can keep it on your phone, but as we all know, apps are constantly being updated for new operating systems and security problems and bugs and all that kind of thing. So eventually people will have TikTok on their phones and it will probably stop working. But that it remains to be seen how long a period of time that is.
But the big fear here is just the fact that this is a Chinese corporation and there isn't a separation between private and public sector in China like they say that there is, or try to pretend that there is in certain instances. And they're able to, scoop tons and tons of data on US citizens, right? Isn't that the basis of the sort of fear behind this?
That's part of it. The other part of it is, and you saw this in a lot of the hearings that have been held on this issue, that different pieces of information did not get the kind of play on TikTok that they did on other social media platforms. And that there were accusations that TikTok was being selective in sort of what content was able to make it through and what content maybe was deliberately depopularized. There was not just the scooping up data question. And a lot of the people who opposed the TikTok ban said, look, the Chinese can get this through a lot of different commercial sources. The sort of propaganda side of it, which is what you saw in some of the hearings, was something that was, I think, a little bit more difficult to defend against.
So do you think this is going to have much of an effect on the larger US-China competition right now, or is this sort of just another thing on the sort of agenda as far as difficult issues to deal with between the US and China goes?
Yeah, I don't think that this meaningfully affects the big picture when it comes to China. I think it is one more thing, but I don't think that the Chinese view this as some sort of existential, enormous problem. I do think that some of the advocates are right that you may see some retaliatory actions by the Chinese in terms of, U.S. apps, U.S. platforms, that kind of thing. But I don't think that it meaningfully affects the U.S.-China relationship in the same way that, say, tariffs do, or speakers of the House taking trips to Taiwan.
Right. All right, Chris Tuttle, I appreciate your time and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kelly. Glad to be here.
Thank you again to Chris for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen. And tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.